Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and today our guest is Professor Patrick Kors. An assistant professor of history at Yale, Professor Kors teaches courses in U.S. international history and the history of European and international politics. He is the author of The Unfinished Peace After World War I. Professor Kors is currently working on a history of the Pax Americana, which reappraises American pursuits of a new world order, from their origins to the Cold War, and explores how far they contributed to the emergence of a more legitimate international system. Welcome, Professor Kors.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Let's begin with your first book, The Unfinished Peace After World War I. What is its premise?
Well, its premise, in short, is that in my interpretation, it would be misleading to regard the era after World War I as one marked by the illusion of peace, by the failure of making any kind of peace. What I'm looking at is rather the construction of something that emerged in the 1920s as a transatlantic peace system. But I also argue, and that is somewhat different from previous interpretations, that one shouldn't focus too much on the peace negotiations at Versailles in 1919. In looking for the origins of this peace, but rather look at efforts that were made in the 1920s to reform what was originally a not so stable international order at Versailles, and that is what I'm looking at, and I'm particularly interested in reappraising the role that the United States and Britain played in this process.
Okay, and what drew you to this topic?
In a way, I've always been generally interested in origins of wars and what made for workable, lasting peace systems, especially in the 20th century. And this book offers in some ways an explanation of why it came to a Second World War. And that's, of course, a big question, and that has sort of caught my interest for a long time. And one particular, I think, point here is that I've long been interested in transatlantic relations and in the role that the United States played in the emergence of a really global international order from the 19th century onwards to the era of the Cold War. And so, all of this, I thought the era after World War I was an interesting one to focus on all these interests that I had.
Okay. I imagine that there is quite a bit of archival material out there. Tell us a little bit about the research you needed to do for the book.
Yes, it's at once, I guess, quite challenging, but also a lot of fun in a way, because I think that to be really valuable nowadays, history should be written in this kind of area as genuinely international history, which means that one has to go to a lot of archives in different countries. In my projects, this mainly involves archival research in the United States, but also in Europe in particular, in Britain, in France, and in Germany. It requires me to go to Paris on a regular basis, so there are many sacrifices involved.
Yes, tough, I'm sure. In writing the book, did you think that perhaps there are any lessons to be learned here, for instance, regarding like the Middle East conflicts and other regions that are in conflict?
I would say so, yes. I mean, it is always difficult to draw lessons from historical periods and to find very exact analogies, but I think one of the things I'm trying to analyze in this book is what I regard as the emergence of a Franco-German peace process with two very distinct states and sets of interests in Weimar Germany of the time and France, having a lot of conflicts over salient issues. And so I'm not least looking at the question what an outside broker, a third force, a kind of arbiter can do, and in this particular case what Britain and the United States could do to, in a way, enable such a peace process to have any kind of success. And this, of course, requires not least taking over international commitments. And the United States, after the First World War, was a power after the treaty negotiations of Versailles and the rejection of the Treaty of Versailles by the American Congress that seemingly did not want to take on any international commitments to security, to European reconstruction. But as my book, I think, shows to a certain extent, this is partly a myth. So the difficulties involved for a power to actually play a constructive international brokering role I think, are a central theme of the book. And I think this is something that if we look at the Middle East nowadays, or efforts to, for example, reform the international financial order that seem to be quite on the agenda, a lot of lessons can be drawn from the successes, but also, of course, notably the failures of the interwar period.
Okay. And you're working on a new book, A History of the Pax Americana. Did the idea of that book grow out of this first book?
Yes, to a certain extent. I would like to say, first of all, that the Pax Americana is in quotation marks.
Okay.
So it's a book about an idea, but also the translation of the idea of a kind of American peace, such as Woodrow Wilson tried to promote in 1918, 1919, but also the successive generations under the Roosevelt administration, the Truman administrations tried to promote. And yes, in a way, the period that I'm especially interested in is marked by 2 world wars and 2 attempts to reorder the international system, and the United States played a very marked role in both attempts. So this book is really an attempt to try to look at this period in one coherent analysis, which is quite somewhat of an undertaking, but I'm especially interested in these, lessons and learning processes that you mentioned. What was different after 1945? How far did, for example, American policymakers try to draw lessons from the failures of Versailles, from the failures of stabilizing, for example, a democratic Germany in the 1920s, and what did they try to do differently under the conditions of the emerging Cold War? So clearly there's a relation between the first book and the second book. All very boring, maybe.
Not at all. So in terms of, the new book that you're working on, I know you're in the process of writing it. Can you share any of your findings at this point, any highlights that we can look forward to reading about?
I think it's really an ongoing process, but I've become ever more interested in looking at what I would call the history of ideas, not just the ideas of, let's say, the big 3 at Versailles or the great statesmen, but also ideas that were brought forward by non-governmental groups, peace activists, others who tried to have an influence of how the United States redefined its international role, and to compare, what some of these groups, the League to Enforce Peace or others, try to have in terms of influence on the international system, and compare that with what, for example, state planning, State Department planning amounted to. And I think this is a very quite a complex history, but also a very kind of rewarding history. It tries to open the view on international history as not being just maybe all too stuffy, old, boring diplomatic history, but a more comprehensive international history. These are not very precise findings, but I think that's sort of what I'm particularly working on at this point.
Okay, and do you have any kind of a timeline for the new book? When can we expect it?
I'll be on leave next year, so I hope to make quite some headway on this book then. I would be somewhat surprised if I actually managed to finish it, because it's quite a big book in the making, but it should come out in the foreseeable future.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being with us here today and sharing some of your research.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Okay. For more information about Professor Kors and his work, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Please be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies.